Hey, it's the Worth Knowing live stream on my Substack, Worth Knowing with Matt Robeson, also on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube, both portrait and landscape. So theoretically, you could watch this on your phone and laptop at the same time if you were a maniac. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn. I'm going to keep this introduction relatively brief today because I really want to get to today's outstanding guest who is lurking off stage in the green room. We have a lot of ground to cover. Our theme today is the set of legal stories shaking U.S. politics right now. And the word shaking is doing a lot of work in that sense because it seems like what's happening currently, a set of moves that are swaying the very foundation of the rule of law, really the rule of the Constitution. That's what's happening. Some of the most fundamental issues of how much power presidents have and what they can do to us with that power. Take a step back and look at what we've seen in recent months. President Trump couldn't get career prosecutors to indict his political enemies, so he put his henchmen, people, into those positions until Alina, Habba, and Lindsey, Halligan, and others were ruled to have been unlawfully appointed. The Department of Justice then took the approach of trying to Jedi mind trick the courts, saying these aren't the hacks you're looking for, by continuing to list Lindsey Halligan on court filings in various cases, which of course caused judges to lash out about it, understandable, which of course then prompted Attorney General Pam Bondi to attack the judges. Look at the Venezuelan boat bombings and the charges of potential war crimes. You have the President of the United States taking military action against people he declares to be enemy combatants, but without a declaration of war, which the Constitution says the Congress absolutely needs to do to go to war. We see the administration dancing on the head of the pin, although these are no angels, over the president's authority as commander-in-chief, not only to engage in those strikes, but also to limit or just plain hide information about them. You have a Supreme Court case, with the arguments being heard just yesterday, over whether the president can ignore a longstanding law meant to protect agency independence and just get rid of whoever he wants anyway. Supreme Court also decided to hear a case about whether President Trump can simply end birthright citizenship despite the very clear, plain English, strict constructionist, if you will, language in the 14th Amendment protecting it. And of course, just in the last 24 hours, we've seen an explosive new inquiry from federal judge James Boasberg into whether Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem simply ignored a judicial order, just flat out ignored it, in delivering 100 Venezuelan men to a notorious prison in El Salvador back in March. What ties all of it together is a consistent pattern of Trump and his hench people trying to obey not the law, not endeavoring to faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of their ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Does that sound familiar? But instead, to try to sneak around, backdoor, trick, and undermine the law. And I know it sounds hyperbolic. I know it sounds abstract to talk about the rule of law, but I think it's very tangible to say that the Trump administration is breaking basic rules about how the government can snatch you up or put you on trial or kill you or decide to do whatever they want, whenever they want, despite what our democratically elected leaders say through our laws. And I don't think it's going too far to say all of this foundation is being badly shaken right now. Our guest today is Army veteran, 30-year federal prosecutor, legal and media juggernaut, Glenn Kirschner. Glenn, I think that was, I risk, as I say, being hyperbolic in that introduction, but it doesn't feel hyperbolic to me.
I don't know. You called me a juggernaut, Matt. I'm going to go with that was the only hyperbolic thing I heard.
You have the bald-headed, goateed, Breaking Bad-esque kind of. You look like a juggernaut, man. You're very intimidating. I'm sure you use
called Ermintrout from Breaking Bad. That tells you how old I look, I guess.
I mean, that is something. I'm sure you use that to great avail as a prosecutor. Maybe let's start off there. I know you were just live streaming earlier today, so I don't want to make you repeat yourself, but you are omnipresent in media. I'd like to talk a little bit about this Boasberg inquiry. Could you catch us up maybe on what's going on there and what issues you saw at play?
This is one of the legal developments that I'm actually pretty excited about. So back on March 15th, Judge Boasberg, who, full disclosure, I used to supervise when he was a federal homicide prosecutor.
Wow.
He was my trial partner in a double homicide case of two senior citizens, a brother and sister, just trying to live out their golden years in a home together in D.C., and they were literally butchered, slaughtered in their own home. Jeb and I, Judge Boasberg and I, tried that case. You want to take the measure of a man, try a double homicide case with him for weeks on end. He has been sort of slowly and methodically sawing the legal wood in front of him, waiting for an opportunity to test whether the Trump administration intentionally defied his orders back on March 15th when he said, turn the planes around. The Trump administration had hastily stuffed 137 Venezuelan immigrants into a plane, violating their constitutional due process rights. Don't take it from me. The Supreme Court ultimately said they did not enjoy the constitutional rights they were entitled to, delivered them to not just El Salvador, but to a terrorism prison in El Salvador, and had the El Salvadoran authorities confine these men at our direction. They had committed no crimes. They'd been convicted of no crimes. They were not, in a position to be serving a sentence. I mean, this is just horrific circumstance piled one on top of another, perpetrated by our government, by the Trump administration. So Judge Boasberg, ever since, has been biding his time, letting the case work its way through the appellate system. It is now back in his trial court, and he has been given the green light to conduct potential contempt hearings. So he just set some evidentiary hearings in this case, and I'm going to be attending court live because I want to see how these things go. On Monday, he will be taking the evidence from Irez Ruvini, who people may remember he's been called a whistleblower, but this guy was a DOJ lawyer for a long time, who also sort of worked to support the Trump administration's Muslim ban in the first Trump administration. This guy, you can't accuse him of being some, radical left lunatic, which is what the Trump administration likes to label anybody when that person, disagrees with anything the Trump administration says or does. So, this guy came forward and said that Emil Bove, who was then the acting deputy attorney general, the number 2 in the Department of Justice, gathered a bunch of DOJ lawyers together and said, these planes will not, I'm going to paraphrase, these planes will not be stopped. And if judges try to order them stopped, we're going to have to consider telling the judges, F you.
You can curse. It's okay.
Yeah. In my career as a federal prosecutor, I have never heard anybody come within 100 miles of suggesting that that's how we should treat federal court judges. It was the exact opposite in my lived experience. So on Monday, this coming Monday at 9:30 a.m. in Judge Boasberg's courtroom, Irez Ruvini, who of course was, unlawfully terminated from the Department of Justice because he had the temerity to tell the truth about what was going on inside Trump's DOJ, he will be testifying. And I can't wait. I know we already have a good sense of what he's going to say because he appeared on 60 Minutes and laid it all out. Now he's going to be under oath, and he's going to be examined by Judge Boasberg, interestingly, and then by the parties. They'll have an opportunity to examine and cross-examine Mr. Ruvini. So, that will set the stage, because the next day at 2 p.m., Judge Boasberg has set an evidentiary hearing at which Drew Ensign will testify. Now, Drew Ensign is one of these dirty DOJ lawyers that, Trump brought in that has been criticized by judges left, right, and center for, not being candid with the court, for outright making misrepresentations to the court. This was in the Abrego Garcia case. Judge Sinis said lots of critical things about Drew Ensign's representations. This is in the Guatemalan unaccompanied minors, the Guatemalan children case, where I've got the Washington Post headline about Drew Ensign here, where a Trump-appointed judge said that Ensign made false claims in court to hastily deport Guatemalan kids. That's the headline, and the article supports that. So, and of course, in this case itself, the Venezuelan deportation case, Ensign said some things that appeared not to be quite candid with Judge Boasberg, like, I have no knowledge of ongoing deportation proceedings while they were virtually stuffing Venezuelans onto a plane. Matt, I can't wait to see how that examination of Drew Ensign unfolds. But let me give everybody something to keep an eye out for. Drew
Please.
Ensign might have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination for the things he has represented and misrepresented in federal courts and not just in this case. So we'll see how that testimony plays out. But listen, right now, it appears that Kristi Noem is the point person for purposes of possible contempt because she is the one who ultimately made the decision. Nope, those planes are going to keep going and we're going to deliver those Venezuelan immigrants to that prison in El Salvador. I am really excited because this is the rule of law at work, notwithstanding the Trump administration trying to walk the rule of law deep into the woods and shoot it dead. Judge Boasberg will not allow it.
I want to do several things very rapidly. First of all, if you like what you just heard from Glenn Kirschner, which you surely should, and you want to get this kind of comprehensive day-to-day coverage of everything that is going on, and there is, as I promised at the top, so very much going on right now, I would urge you to subscribe to his Substack, glennkirschner.substack.com. There's a community meeting that you host every night. It is you to camera, sometimes with a guest. It is hypnotic. It is fascinating. It is chock full of facts and your deep expertise. Don't limit yourselves, people, to just catching Glenn on MS Now. You can get him directly streamed right into your veins on Substack every night. Second of all, I want to do a shout out here to all the people in the chats who are teeing up good observations, questions, and this one from Lefty Gramps, just referring to our mutual friend, Tony Michaels. Yes, he's still on daily at noon, live streaming, and always a good watch that, I urge people to check out. Talk to me a little bit more about contempt. It's the kind of thing that you see in, judicial procedurals, like I hold you in contempt, the system's in contempt. But explain to a layperson what that means. Play the movie for me of what if Judge Boasberg finds contempt against these contemptible characters? What would that look like? What would the remedy be? What would the sanction be? And would Trump just try to work his way around it?
Yeah, boy, the last question is the one that sort of upsets me the most, because if somebody's held in contempt, criminal contempt, we'll talk about the different kinds of contempt, but might Trump just try to pardon him? But before we get there are different kinds of contempt and they have different purposes. So civil contempt, when an executive branch and administration is kind of flirting with or outright violating court orders, a judge can hold the administration or any number of administration officials in civil contempt. Usually that is a vehicle to try to get them to come into compliance with the court's orders. For example, Judge Royce Lamberth, longtime federal district court judge in DC. He is a lion in criminal justice circles. You can look at his history. He has held government officials in contempt. He once held the entire EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in contempt to get the agency and its officials to comply with his court orders. So civil contempt can involve fines, and those fines can increase over time if the administration or administration officials continue to defy court orders. So civil contempt is one form of contempt. And of course, if it's egregious enough, it can be criminal contempt. And with criminal contempt, the sort of contemnor, fancy way to say the person who defied the order. Let's assume it's Kristi Noem who actually gets identified during the course of this litigation as the person who knowingly violated the judge's order to turn the planes around. The administration is playing games trying to say, well, you might have issued an oral order, but that wasn't really an order. We have to wait for a written order, and all of which is nonsense. If a judge announces in open court, hey, turn the planes around, sorry, that's a court order, just as enforceable as if he issued it later in the day in writing and entered it on the court docket. So, but once it looks like somebody may have criminal contempt proceedings initiated against them, they're going to have the full panoply of rights, like due process rights of notice and opportunity to be heard and make their case in court, the very rights they deprived these Venezuelans and others of. They're going to enjoy. The Kristi Noems of the world will enjoy their full due process rights. And criminal contempt can include up to and including prison time to punish the intentional defiance, violation of federal court orders. And Matt, that is the way the rule of law remains viable. That's the way others are deterred from intentionally defying federal court orders, which this administration flirts with doing damn near every day. You have to punish them because that will deter others. Let's face it, if you stop punishing particular crimes, I don't care if it's bank robbery, I don't care if it's contempt of court, I don't care if it's auto theft. Expect more of those crimes. Can you imagine if we announced we will no longer criminally prosecute bank robbers? Do you know what kind of a spike we would see in bank robberies? Well, guess what? Decline to punish this administration for intentionally defying court orders. Expect them to defy more court orders. And goodness knows they're willing to do it. It seems to be the age of lawlessness in the Trump administration. And this is something that the system needs to rise up and, hold these folks accountable for.
Now, I'm picking up a fair amount of understandable cynicism from our friends out in the chats. Lefty Gramps, this is a pungent phrase, does anyone really think anything will happen to Ice Barbie? Our friend MJ, nobody is paying a fine, nobody's going to jail. Nothing will happen unless Impotus decides he would like you in prison. Oh, that's a good one. I haven't heard that one before. I am reminded somewhat of the famous, perhaps somewhat apocryphal story of President Andrew Jackson defying the Supreme Court's ruling in Worcester versus Georgia, saying John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it.
Yeah.
Is there ultimately an ability for the Trump administration and their hench people to just say, hey, courts, Boasberg, fuck you, go pound sand, as Emile Beauvais apparently did? Can they simply say, I want to watch the courts come after us and enforce it? That would seem to be a very Trumpian move. Is there any remedy for that?
There is, but let me first say, I understand the skepticism. I have spent the Trump years, I retired during the first Trump administration. I served continuously under every president from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump in his first administration. And that was when it was time for me to retire, because I was old enough and I had enough time in service to take a retirement. And I moved on to this professional chapter 2, which
you retired. Does this beat golf?
Yeah, I don't golf. I'm sorry. I'm not going to go off on golfers, but you know what? I grew up a poor gutter kid from Jersey. We didn't have money for greens fees, and I don't even know what greens fees are. Okay. We played kick the can and stoop ball. That's what we played, stick ball. My metal train just jumped the tracks.
Yeah, I was asking for, you played the movie of what would happen next, and now I'm asking for the sequel, Electric Boogaloo. What if they tell the judges to pound sand? Is there a remedy for that?
There is. And so I explain how things operate. I explain how the rule of law and the Constitution has always operated in my 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I understand the skepticism because guess what? It hadn't operated the way it's supposed to operate in the Trump years. So I get everybody saying nobody's going to be held accountable. So here's the thing. Let's assume that Judge Boasberg holds somebody in contempt and he has to execute a contempt order, including a confinement order. The way things are supposed to work is the United States Marshal Service, which, let me tell you, they always get their man and their woman, if the woman is the wanted person. And I worked with them for decades. I hold the U.S. Marshal Service in high regard. The federal law requires that the U.S. Marshal Service will enforce federal court orders. So people are going to say, but the U.S. Marshal Service is part of the Department of Justice. So won't that whole agency go rogue and defy the federal law? I really effing hope not. I don't expect they will, because my lived experience with them is that no, they're not going to violate the rule of law because a corrupt agency head or a corrupt AG or a corrupt president won't like it if they fulfill their legal obligation to execute federal court orders. But I can only talk about how things are supposed to work, not how they will work. This is largely uncharted territory, uncharted waters. And the good news at the end of it all, Matt, is I don't think this is sustainable. What the Trump administration is doing, I don't believe is sustainable in the long run. I often will add that I don't think these imbeciles, these idiots, and these incompetents that Donald Trump has put in positions of power have what it takes to end American democracy. I just don't. They're doing a hell of a lot of damage. They're running roughshod, but I think it's all ultimately going to implode. I don't know when. I don't know how much damage Trump and company will do in the interim. They're running out of lawyers to walk into. They're running at the. We'll get to the Alina Habbas. We'll get to the Lindsey Halligans. We'll get to the Bill Assailies. We'll get to all of them. But it's all kind of imploding on itself. They're running out of dirty lawyers to send in to these federal courts and lie. They're being booted out. They're resigning. And it's going to get worse, not better, because there's not only a brain drain at my beloved former home, the Department of Justice, there's an ethics drain. And you don't have many, Drew ensigns left to go in and make misrepresentations to multiple federal court judges. We have to hold fast, but we have to do more than hold fast. We have to fight like hell every day to make sure we are standing up, speaking out, staying strong, marching, protesting, and it's always been up to we the people. It will always be up to we the people. And I think we remain up to the task. But listen, I can't vouch for any of this working the way it's supposed to work. I can only talk about how it's supposed to work.
Since you invoked the name of Alina Habba, I'd like to go there. This was the subject of your live stream last night, which was on point as always. This was also kind of the subject of my most recent article in Newsweek this past Friday. Also on worthknowing.substack.com, my Substack, which I would urge people to subscribe to. Pretty please and thank you if you want to catch all of my writing and other work and live streams with people like Glenn Kirschner. My argument was Donald Trump essentially created a catch-22 trap for himself by drumming out the competent people from the administration in an attempt to debathify and purge what he saw as the deep state. And so he's ended up with not the A team, B team, C team. There's no B.A. Baracus coming to save him here. He's ended up with the F team of, low-grade professionals who are incompetent hacks. See Exhibit A, Alina Habba, who has just resigned. And as I alluded to at the top of the show, you have this back and forth going on with Lindsey Halligan, who was found to have been improperly put into her office and yet is still appearing on legal filings from the Department of Justice, prompting a pretty fiery back and forth between DOJ and federal judges. What stood out to you from the Alina Habba resignation first, and what are you making of this very odd attempt from DOJ to keep Lindsey Halligan on court filings?
They're not going to win this battle. Listen, the rule of law asserted itself in the Alina Habba debacle. First of all, the federal trial court judge, after a hearing, ruled that Alina Habba was in the job unlawfully. Then the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that ruling. And as a result of those two court rulings, what happened? Alina Habba resigned. That's the way the rule of law is supposed to work. So I was thrilled to say she resigned. She's going to go be some special assistant to Bondi. Fine. Go to Main Justice and do whatever you're going to do. And now my next question is, will the people of New Jersey get some qualified acting U.S. attorney in there somehow, some way? I saw the reporting was that 3 current prosecutors from the New Jersey U.S. Attorney's Office will share acting U.S. attorney duties. I don't know how that's going to work. I can only hope, and I haven't seen the names. They are 3 career public servants, 3 career federal prosecutors from that office, not other flunkies that Bondi has snuck in there as a special U.S. attorney, which is actually a thing. It's a position. But the rule of law worked. Ultimately, it took longer than it should have, but in the Federal District of New Jersey, it worked. I'm going to go down to the Eastern District of Virginia and say the rule of law is also holding there. I don't know precisely today what Lindsey Halligan's title is. Is she a special assistant U.S. attorney? Is she, special counsel to the attorney general? Is she acting this or pretending that? I don't know what she is. But what happened? The courts ruled that she was similarly unlawfully in the position. And what happened? Judge Curry, who we had to bring up from South Carolina to avoid a conflict in the Eastern District, she ruled that because she was unlawfully in the job, she didn't have the lawful authority to set one damn foot in the grand jury room. We take the grand jury secrecy very, very seriously. And so Judge Curry dismissed both indictments, the one against Jim Comey and the one against Letitia James. That's the system working. That's the rule of law asserting itself. You know, for all of the horror stories that we're contending with, the rule of law continues to assert itself, even if it's, you know, later than we would like. So, and then moving forward, what happened? Well, Lindsey Halligan went into the grand jury unlawfully and walked out with an indictment against Letitia James. But then when a career AUSA, and we can talk about who this person is from Missouri in a minute if you like, when somebody who actually knows how a grand jury is supposed to operate walked in, he walked out with a no bill because the grand jury said, no, we're not going to re-indict Letitia James. What does that do? That tells you a lot about what Lindsey Halligan must have done in that grand jury to twist their arm and walk out with an indictment when an actual federal prosecutor who walked in and tried to do the same thing fell flat on his face. The jury, sitting as the conscience of the community, said, oh, hell no, not on this evidence. We are not indicting Letitia James for bank fraud. Similarly, in the James Comey case, that case I don't think can ever be rebrought because of the statute of limitations problem. And we can talk about why that is, because the 6-month saving statute will not apply because there was never a validly issued indictment by the grand jury in the first instance. So what is this? This is the rule of law asserting itself and winning the day. So, you know, we focus on the horror stories, but we got to focus on the points of light too.
It's an interesting point you're making. And look, I know I was having some fun with the headline for this, and it's worthwhile. And I think it's true in my intro that there is a real shaking of the foundations. It's like, these are kids. You ever go camping and your kids like really like yank on the tent poles and you're like, please don't do that. You know, that might all come crashing down on us. But you're making an interesting argument that it's shaken, but it's not crashing. And that's important. It's important to bear in mind. I think hope is a strategy here. We can't devolve into thinking that everything is lost. And yet I kind of want to go 30,000 feet with you and ask a little bit about the broader legal edifice, the broader legal picture. You were bringing up an interesting angle on all of this earlier, that Trump may be running out of inexperienced hacks and rotten lawyers to avail himself of. There's, you know, I dabbled with the idea. I got a master's degree in public policy, which was a mistake because it makes you a jack of all trades, master of none. I don't know why I did that. And I was very tempted to go to law school. And I kind of, one of the reasons I didn't was that I had a lot of friends and colleagues who were saying, you know, this ends up being a treadmill, man. You know, the way our legal system works is you finish law school, but you don't actually know much from a practical standpoint. You have to go work at a law firm and you have to clerk. You have to get practical experience. Well, what are we seeing? We're seeing the law firms, many of the most prominent law firms in America have knuckled under to Trump's assault, have done deals with him, have promised pro bono work to kind of, I don't know what exactly they've agreed to here. And you're seeing competent lawyers being drummed out. You had this massive story in the New York Times interviewing 60 plus former DOJ prosecutors, lawyers who painted a really staggering picture of being asked to do illegal things. It seems like we're essentially eviscerating a generation of competent, able professionals who respect the rule of law. And we're also assaulting kind of the machinery that produces the next generation of lawyers and tainting them all with this, you know, deal with the devil that's been put in place on top of the law firms. Taking a step back, how worried are you, despite the case you just made that the rule of law is holding, how worried are you that the overall well is being poisoned in how we kind of create the machinery of the legal system in America?
Yeah, I'm worried about all of that every minute of every day. And you just set it out well, Matt. And now I'm going to take the big orange dark cloud that you just delivered to us. And I'm going to try not to be Pollyanna, but I'm going to talk about a little bit of the silver lining behind that big orange dark cloud.
Yes. Give me the blue lining to the orange cloud.
so many of the good people, that I worked with at the DC U.S. Attorney's Office for decades, some of them have been unlawfully terminated because they worked J6 cases, some of them because they were on Jack Smith's team. Some of my former homicide prosecutors from the DC office went over to work for Jack Smith's team. So many of these people who have left or been wrongfully terminated from the Department of Justice have made their way out into state attorneys general offices, to state prosecutors' offices, to nonprofit organizations, and they continue to do the hard work of the American people. They just don't do it at the Department of Justice anymore. And I think that actually strengthens, in many ways, the rule of law as it is practiced in the states, in AG offices, in state attorneys' offices, Commonwealth attorneys' offices, and district attorneys' offices. And I even want to focus more directly on nonprofits, because nonprofits are going into court every day by the dozens and kicking the ass of Donald Trump's hapless Department of Justice lawyers. Do you know when the Supreme Court, maybe we'll get to birthright citizenship, but this is a great sort of dovetail. This is a great dovetail. When the Supreme Court handed down the horrific ruling, in my view, that, you know what, we just don't care for nationwide injunctions, even though a president probably unconstitutionally tried to, pick up his Sharpie with his little hand and cross out the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship from the Constitution. There seemed to be a tacit admission by even the Supreme Court, yeah, that's probably unconstitutional. And on January 3rd, January 23rd, 3 days after he did it, a Ronald Reagan appointed judge named John Coffenauer ruled that it was blatantly unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court said, well, okay, but we don't like nationwide injunctions as the vehicle for people's constitutional rights to be protected. We think, and the litigant in that case won a temporary injunction, a TRO. And so the Supreme Court is saying, so every single person who is suffering the consequences of this unlawful, unconstitutional act by Donald Trump should have to hire lawyers, should have to go into court, and should have to win the same battle that one litigant just won. That's not workable. That's not fair. If it's unconstitutional as to one, it's unconstitutional as to all. But when they handed down, I call it the Jerry Seinfeld, no soup for you, no nationwide injunctions for you. When they handed that down, they said they cracked the door open to what? Class actions as a different vehicle, separate and apart from nationwide injunctions. And do you know what 4 nonprofit organizations did? They sprinted to court. They didn't walk to court. They sprinted to court. They had a federal judge certify a class of people who need to be protected from Donald Trump's unconstitutional attempted revocation of birthright citizenship. And the class that was certified was all infants born on or after February 20th, which was the day he tried to sign the day that the birthright citizenship revocation executive order went into effect, and all infants born or unborn moving forward. And the judge issued basically an injunction for that class, but it's not a nationwide injunction. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, Supreme Court. Those 4 nonprofit organizations, Democracy Defenders Fund, that's Norm Eisen's group,
yes,
the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU, and the Asian Law Caucus. Those 4 nonprofits with great lawyers, some of whom are former government lawyers, went into court and protected us all, protected all of the infants born and unborn who would have been victimized by Donald Trump's unconstitutional act. We don't pay these people, but these lawyers are literally fighting for our rights by the dozens in court every day, and they're winning, and they're winning, and they're winning. Not everything, but most cases. And, that is another piece of silver lining, because many of these lawyers are former government lawyers, and they're in there kicking the Trump administration's ass and protecting our rights, which is why I never tell anybody who to support or who to donate money to or who to actually spend your time assisting with door knock campaigns. You know what? You're an accountant. Volunteer your accounting services for one of these organizations, because there are dozens of them out there. And in a very real sense, they're doing legal work that's benefiting us.
I want to change gears, and maybe there's a nexus here between the point you were just making and where I wanted to go. I want to refer you to a piece of reporting that was done by our friend Cliff Schechter, by his Blue Amp Media, and David Schuster, who appears there on Blue Amp, about another boat strike that's gotten a little bit less attention than the September 2nd one. An instance where there were, again, multiple survivors, it seems 2 survivors of the strike, who were brought aboard a U.S. military vessel and were designated as unprivileged belligerents. And the military personnel who essentially were processing these individuals, following the rules for doing so, the handbook essentially for dealing with wounded and unknown treatment, the procedures for people with that status, were instructed to delete visual evidence, to delete video and photographic evidence of the intake of these individuals. Now, as an Army vet, as a former prosecutor, I imagine that this sends your hackles up, that at the very least, the suggestion that there's a destruction of evidence going on would make you damn suspicious. But I don't want to put words into your mouth. What did you make of this revelation?
Yeah, so a couple of things. As an active duty Army JAG for 6.5 years before I joined the Department of Justice, what I see going on in international waters makes me sick. The way I see them endangering our troops by putting them in compromising situations makes me sick. And this is murder. I mean, I have a military expert by the name of Dan Maurer, who taught constitutional law at West Point, as a retired career Army JAG, and we talk regularly on my Substack show. And he made clear, I mean, there is no defense for this. It violates domestic law. It violates international law. It violates the law of war. It violates, the Department of Defense manual, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the manual for courts martial. There's no defense to these unlawful killings. I'm a little upset that we're getting so consumed by the second strike, because it tends to distract from the fact that the first strikes, 86 dead, were all similarly unlawful. The second strike is particularly gruesome when you are, quote, blowing out of the water people who are injured courtesy of the first strike and clinging to burning wreckage. Even if we were at war, we wouldn't be blowing them out of the water. But what I make of the destruction of evidence as a career prosecutor, both military and then civilian, I saw destruction of evidence a lot in my cases, and I welcomed it. I didn't celebrate the fact that evidence had been destroyed, but it was some of the strongest evidence of consciousness of guilt that I could present to a jury. So when our own government is destroying evidence, the only reasonable inference we can draw, and ultimately a jury will draw when these people are put on trial for what they're doing, because they must be win, lose, or draw. When the rule of law comes back into the light of day, they must be tried for their crimes. And the inference that the jury will draw is they were covering up their own criminal conduct. That's why you destroy evidence. And it's so telling, Matt, that Pete Hegseth, who treats all of this like it's some video game, couldn't release these boat strikes, the first strikes, fast enough on video so he could beat his chest and say, look at what a strong man I am. And yet when it came to the second strike, when even Donald Trump said, yeah, I'm all for releasing it, Hegseth is like, oof, why? Because that's going to turn public sentiment when they see United States forces blowing helpless, wounded human beings out of the water criminally. And I hope it comes out, because what we need is to see these abuses, just like when we see the violations of constitutional rights of not just migrants, not just immigrants, documented or undocumented, but U.S. citizens, because, they're violations of the Fourth Amendment. Prohibition against unreasonable searches and seizures doesn't discriminate. They're doing it to Americans too. When we see it with our own eyes, it begins to move public sentiment. So we need to see these abuses, as painful as they are to watch, because that's going to help galvanize us and motivate us to make sure we do everything we can to put a stop to it.
I want to note that currently in the comments, there is a dissenting set of opinions being offered by someone whose handle is Tony Tigress 77. And I often say that if people aren't engaged in outright trolling on this show, we have no fear of differing opinions, dissenting opinions, strong avowals of a different perspective, we'll just say. And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I just want to continue on the line that you were just discussing, because it really resonates with me. I've been thinking about writing about this. Maybe I'll pitch this to Newsweek as soon as we're done. But this point about how, as a prosecutor, you sort of relished the destruction of evidence because it was such a sure tell of the state of mind of guilt. It feels to me like we now have a repeated pattern with Trump and his hench people. I'm going to coin that, by the way, copyright, hench people. Going back to, for example, his first impeachment, the Ukraine transcript. It was clearly a violation of law, and it was hidden inside classified systems. You have cases of allegations, at the very least, of the use of burn bags, destruction of evidence. This was brought to light by CREW, the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, the disappearance of electronic communications. Obviously, the whole case of taking classified files and hiding them in your bathroom and doing who knows what with them. We see time after time a pattern with Trump of pursuing a concealment, hiding evidence, even down to the policy of ICE officers, I guess we'll call them, wearing masks. It seems to be a larger pattern that runs through a lot of what Trump does in government. Do you see the same thing? And does it suggest to you an awareness, a state of mind, an awareness that maybe they have crossed the line into criminal activity?
Oh, goodness. Listen, I prosecuted RICO cases in federal court in D.C. I was part of the trial team for the largest RICO case we ever brought in D.C. And I see the Trump administration as a corrupt enterprise, RICO, racketeer influenced and corrupt organizations. I mean, I see a lot of similarities between, a mafia organization and the Trump organization. You've got the boss, you've got the underboss, that would be the vice president. You've got the consigliere, that would be the dirty lawyer over at the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi. You've got the capos, you've got the wise guys, you've got the captains. The people that he has brought in to try to deconstruct all of the institutions of government, it looks a lot like a criminal organization to me. So, but the one thing I will say is the federal government has been, I don't want to say this flippantly. I was going to say hiding embarrassing evidence for a very long time in both administrations. But, it seems like the default of our federal government is secrecy. And we're always ginning up reasons to decline to release things to the public. Now, mind you, there are some good reasons. We do not want to compromise national security by releasing things that shouldn't be released. We don't want to compromise sources and methods. If we have folks out in foreign countries who are doing the hard covert work of the American people, we don't want to compromise their safety. We don't want to give up our sources and methods. If we have a pending investigation or an upcoming prosecution, no, we don't want to just start spewing evidence into the public square that could hamper our ability to successfully prosecute the case or hamper the defendant's ability to get a fair trial rather than poisoning the well of public opinion against the defendant. So there are a lot of good reasons for what I'll call secrecy, for declining to, release information publicly. But I think that should be the exception. I think there should be narrowly defined areas where our government hides information from the American people. And I think the default, Matt, should be transparency. But the default has been secrecy for very long under lots and lots of administrations. And that's part of what's gotten us into this predicament that we're in. I do think the Trump administration does it more than many other administrations. But let's be clear, I'm a rule of law guy. I don't come to these discussions from a place of politics. And I readily admit, as a young man, I voted for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. As an older, wiser, and kinder man, I voted for Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. I've changed my priorities. I truly believe everybody does better when everybody does better. But let's face it, have we seen the names, the 1,000+ names of the men who were involved in Epstein's sex trafficking circle? Who have we seen anybody release those names? You don't think there are Republicans and Democrats and titans of business and industry and big oil and big pharma and big tech and big Hollywood and big finance and the military industrial complex and maybe judges and justices? I don't know, but that's the point. None of us know. What we do know is more than 1,000 girls were sex trafficked. So how many Johns does that make? How many men were involved in those horrific crimes? And yet both administrations have been protecting them. That should tell us something about the nature of our government and how we are always inclined to protect the ruling class criminals, the rich, powerful, influential, connected, often white males. And if we are unwilling to change that, if we're all forever willing to give the ruling class criminals, when we catch them doing crime, non-prosecution agreements, which is the opposite of justice, right? If an underprivileged kid sells a rock of crack or snatches a purse or, shoplifts a stick of deodorant from CVS, which is like the most popular crime in DC ever, take it from a career prosecutor in DC, we jump on them with both feet. We hold them accountable. But you're a ruling class criminal and you're caught, maybe bilking billions of dollars from large swaths of the American population. We give you a non-prosecution agreement. We make you pay fines and back taxes and penalties. And all they do is work it into their operating budget. They pass the expense on to the consumers and they keep criming, which goes back to our earlier discussion about if you don't get after the criminals, expect more crime. And boy, when it comes to the ruling class criminals, we've been giving them a pass forever. That may have gone far afield from whatever your original question was, but
amen. You know what? This is this is an old piece of political wisdom back from my political consulting days. Voters don't mind if you flip-flop as long as you flop to the right place. Voters don't mind if you go onto a different tangent in your answer as long as you end up on something fascinating and worthwhile, which you did, at the risk of creating viewer whiplash. I do want to go to the thread that I teased a moment ago. You brought up the pending birthright citizenship ruling from the Supreme Court. And I want to preamble this by saying that, as I alluded to a moment ago, we have no fear on this show of engaging with people who offer dissenting views, different views, arguments that may contrast with my point of view. That is 100% welcome. Fine. We are going to boot out trolls like the person who offered "you damn crybaby libs." Brilliant argumentation, just absolutely top notch. But I am not going to boot out the comments of Tony Tigress 77. I don't know if this is male. They offered a number of comments. I'm just going to highlight this one because you wanted to talk a little bit about the birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
The argument here, SCOTUS released opinions. They're going to rule in favor of Trump's birthright citizenship executive order. 14th Amendment was meant for babies of slaves. The argument here, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is the 14th Amendment wasn't intended to create birthright citizenship. It was a narrow purpose amendment intended for the children of former slaves. What do you make of that argument? And what do you think the Supreme Court's going to do here?
Yeah, what was the leading Supreme Court case decided in 1898 that said, if you're born here, you're a citizen here. It was a Chinese individual who brought suit. And the Supreme Court ruled, no, that person is a citizen because they were born here. So no, it's not exclusive to slaves. But here's what I'll say, and I welcome disagreement and robust debate, as long as it's polite and civil. My wife, who is an amazing person, who was a retired career immigration lawyer, she and I were having the discussion last night. I think the Constitution says what it says, and it means what it says. If you're born here, you're a citizen. And yes, it says if you're born here and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, but if you're born here, you're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, you don't get a pass. So, and I think that is what the Supreme Court has held consistently since 1898. But I think there are lots of things that our government can do to control the people who come here, who maybe are coming just for the purpose of giving birth on U.S. soil. Because I hate to call out China, but sometimes other countries, and I just did call out China, didn't I, will have package travel deals where if you're a woman who's about to give birth, we can get you to the United States so you can have your child here. Now, the federal government has every right to have a robust visa program that says, listen, if it looks like you're coming to the United States just to take advantage of birthright citizenship, we're going to restrict travel from people who may be trying to take advantage of that. That would be lawful legislation, in my opinion. I am not an immigration law expert, but you can put certain requirements in place before you grant visas to folks to travel here that will tamp down folks who are coming here just to take advantage of dropping a kid on U.S. soil. So there are things that can be done, but unless you're going to amend the Constitution, or, and this is the part that now I'm going to go a little dark, or the Supreme Court chooses to ignore either the express terms of the Constitution or settled precedent of more than 100 years, which they have done repeatedly now. They have contradicted in their rulings the express text of the Constitution, and they have ignored precedent with no compelling explanation for why they're doing it. Now, I agree, you can revisit precedent. If we couldn't, we would still be living under the horrific Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, government-sponsored, racial discrimination. So God bless Brown versus Board of Education. Yes, you can revisit precedent, but Matt, it has almost always been revisited to correct past wrongs and to bestow more rights and protections on people, not taking it away like they did when they, shit-canned Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs decision. So it wouldn't, and the marquee case from the Supreme Court for contradicting the express terms of the Constitution is Trump versus United States. It's the presidential immunity case. When you read the Constitution and it says a president must take care to faithfully execute the laws of the country, the Supreme Court read that and said, oh, well, that means a president can violate the laws of our nation, can victimize large swaths of the American population, and can do so with absolute immunity from prosecution. I'm sorry, that's the opposite of the take care clause. It also happens to be the opposite of the impeachment judgment clause, which says a president can be impeached and removed, and he can still be prosecuted for the same conduct. So that is me going dark because I have no faith. I have no faith in the 6-justice majority of the Supreme Court.
Well, thank goodness, as you pointed out, that stare decisis is no longer necessarily a thing, because at some future time, we can hope that there will be a differently constituted Supreme Court that will look back and decide that the immunity decision was wrongly decided, and we'll see, strict constructionism. It's kind of great. You could just read what it says on the page, and maybe we should have done that in this case. And certainly, I see your point, and I hope if they are still on. That, to Tony Tigress's point, I hope they can see the argument here that, there is a plain English reading to be had here. And that's what really bothers me personally. I'm not a legal scholar like you, but what bothers me here is that Donald Trump seems to think that the US Constitution is subject to the line item veto. It is not. He does not get to simply Sharpie his way, as you suggested, through the Constitution. And he also does not get to Sharpie his way through standing federal laws. And I'd like to finish there. I know this is maybe, in light of the larger constitutional issues we've just been addressing, maybe this seems like a more picayune case, but I think it's not. There is a case where the oral arguments were heard yesterday, Trump versus Slaughter. That sounds very on the nose, but that is a proper noun, not a descriptive one, that involves the president's ability, regardless of a law meant to protect agency independence, the president's ability to simply fire anyone at will that he or someday she deems wanting to fire. This seems abusive. The Supreme Court seems apt to go along with it. I am not sure that I understand. Maybe you can explain to me how, even under a unitary executive theory of government, the Supreme Court can justify simply ignoring a standing federal statute as enacted by Congress. But that seems to be the direction they're going.
Yeah, and again, I can't explain the inexplicable, and I apologize. I'm going to have to bounce in a couple of minutes, but let me try to tackle this as quickly as I can.
Yes, this is the 60-second version.
The Supreme Court seems determined to expand executive power beyond all rational limits, whether those limits are in the Constitution or set by the legislature. We have this thing called checks and balances, but for whatever reason, the Supreme Court is unwilling to, it seems, let the legislature be a reasonable check on executive branch power. Like, there are so many different cases percolating where Donald Trump has fired or tried to dislodge people in violation of federal statutes, like inspectors general. There's a good reason we have inspectors general as quasi-independent people and organizations, because they are our police on the inside of the executive branch, keeping a watch out for fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, and crime. You want them to be independent, at least somewhat, from the potential criminals they're there to keep track of and hold accountable if they do wrong. And yet, so that's why Congress enacts some thoughtful legislation that has passed constitutional muster before, where it's like, okay, you have to give Congress 30 days advance notice if you're going to try to fire an IG, and you can only fire an IG for cause. You just can't do it for no reason, like you don't want them, looking into your wrongdoing. And we've always been willing in any number of settings to allow checks and balances in that way through legislation. I fear the Supreme, maybe the Fed is going to be different, but I fear the Supreme Court is basically going to take all constraints off this criminal president. And I understand they're like, we're writing a rule for the ages. Yes, but we're dealing with somebody who's trying to destroy American democracy. We're dealing with somebody who said, I will be a dictator on day one. Those are his words. To finish his quote, in fairness, which I always do, he said, but only on day one, because as we know, dictators through time, once they come into complete dictatorial power, they voluntarily relinquish it on day two, right? That's what dictators don't do that. So the Supreme Court is not meeting the urgency of the moment. And they are expanding executive branch power in a way that I don't think is required by the Constitution, and it's contrary to the federal law. But this is what they seem to be determined to do. Why? I don't know. I would tell them to watch out, because guess what? There's one thing a dictator has no use for. It's a Supreme Court. They're happy to have inferior courts, but they don't want a Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court justices think an all-powerful Donald Trump won't throw them under the bus eventually, come on, justices, wake up and smell the autocracy.
Yes, just look at the trail of bodies that left behind him of everyone who's ever been loyal to him. Glenn, you've been more than generous with your time. I'm going to get you out of here by saying the comment by My Smith 7. Great guest. Glenn is a serious legal expert. Totally agree. And this is what we try to do here. And I think it's a real sign of the value that you give to your audience every day, every single day on your Substack, that we've seen the numbers for this live stream climb continuously throughout the hour because people are tuning in and staying on because they are really getting informed and engaged by everything you're bringing to bear. I am going to avoid the awkwardness of you having to excuse yourself, just boot you. I'm just going to boot you right out of the stage so you can get on to your next engagement. I'm going to close out the show right now. Glenn Kirschner, thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt.
And let's close out on this. Thank you very much, everyone, for being a part of this, for being part of Worth Knowing. I would ask, urge, request, beseech everyone to come subscribe to worthknowing.substack.com. This is the kind of stuff that I try to bring to you on the Substack every week in the live stream. I'm doing a weekly show with a Republican where we try to make politics fun again. It's called Political Rehab. He's also named Matt. Go figure. And we do a fun kind of PTI meets the Daily Show approach to politics, including a weekly segment that I love doing called That's Bullshit, where I call out a particularly noxious piece of bullshit going around the world at the time. And I'd like to invite you as a bonus for being a subscriber to Worth Knowing. Once you're a subscriber, just email me. My email is right up there. Just email me. I'd love your nominations for what piece of bullshit you'd like to see me take apart in the upcoming week. In the meantime, we have great guests coming up in the rest of December. Really looking forward to it and just really appreciate everyone engaging through the chats, whether you're a longtime chatter here, you're new, and even if you have a diverging point of view, which we are happy to engage with and feature as long as it is positive and substantive. And, we can all evaluate it and have a constructive conversation about politics and the world. On that hopeful and upbeat note, thank you to everyone. Stay safe, be well, and we will see you next week.